tidings, ladies and gentlemen of the Lodge, and welcome back. We've got another Genesis and FF7 video lined up today, where we are going to look deeper into Genesis's arc and figure out why it feels incomplete. When we consider that Zack, Angeal, and even Sephiroth have full and complete, mostly tragic arcs in Crisis Core, in a way, it leaves Genesis floating in limbo. Despite his degradation being cured, his journey still remains, as we say, incomplete. The feeling that Genesis's arc is incomplete, in truth, is my own opinion, but it is one that I have seen expressed in many different spaces, both on and offline. This, along with Genesis's ramblings about Loveless, which shouldn't be ignored, mind you, have made this character for some people tough to understand, and understandably so. But what if I were to tell you that there is a good reason for this? What if I were to tell you there is a mythological explanation for this? What if I were to tell you that Genesis's story was half told on purpose? For more reasons than the ones you might just be thinking. Before I dive into my reasoning, my goal here is to perhaps offer an explanation or perspective that you won't find anywhere else, as I'm sure that many people have offered their thoughts in regards to Genesis, as this is a character that has been around for a long time. But again, I'm here to offer you something that you may not have heard before. So without further ado, let's dive into it. So, the interesting thing about Genesis is that he actually has very similar ambitions to Zack. Both characters are striving to be the hero. Both characters are opting to walk the same path. The details of this path will certainly be different. Now, as for Genesis's arc feeling incomplete, there's both a literal and, as I would say, mythological reason for this. Let's start with the literal setup to begin. We see that at the end of Crisis Core, that Genesis survives, gets cured of his degradation, and then as we see, gets picked up by both Nero and Vice and brought into Deep Ground. We then have the final scene in Dirge of Cerberus, where Genesis himself proclaims,
"We still have much work to do, my brother."
So obviously, it's no surprise or shock that Genesis's story is far from finished, was never finished, and this was always a deliberate action on the part of the devs. Now the question becomes, why? And what do I mean when I tell you there's a mythological explanation for this? Well, in my opinion, it appears to me that Genesis is walking the path of the hero myth. For those unfamiliar to the hero's myth or the hero's journey, this was something put forth by Joseph Campbell and has become a massive influence on storytelling all across our culture and planet. Whether we look at Western properties like Star Wars that directly cite Joseph Campbell's work, or some properties overseas who may not deliberately reference Campbell's work, but it appears obvious to me that the influence is there. If you need further convincing, check out any of my Hero's Journey videos on my channel, 2 of which explore Zack and Cloud from FF7. So before I lay out how this applies to Genesis, take a look at the models that are up on the screen. As we can see, while all have subtle differences, the overall structure is the same. I want to bring our attention to the bottom part of the cycle in the hero's myth. As we can see, right around the step of death and rebirth, or in some models what's cited as the step of transformation, predating that step is what is known as the meeting with the goddess, which is pretty deliberate in Genesis's story. His story in Crisis Core essentially ends with this step of death and rebirth following his literal meeting with the goddess. Seeing how literal this is, and how literal Crisis Core presents these two polarizing characters, both pursuing the path of the hero, it brings us to a place where I feel this hero myth has to at least be considered. So what does this mean for our man Genesis? If his story really fits with the hero's myth, but cuts off at the midpoint, then what we can expect is perhaps the second half of Genesis's journey is yet to take place. Genesis has yet to walk his path of redemption that precedes the death and rebirth transformation. This ultimately is what makes his character feel incomplete when compared to other members of the cast whose arcs are more complete and fleshed out. So if you are like me and you speculate that Genesis will return in Rebirth or some other part of the new FF7 trilogy, then we have to look to his hero's journey and perhaps see this path of redemption. Alternatively, it is also possible that Genesis could be walking a more tragic path akin to Sephiroth. I mean, he was picked up by Deep Ground after all. It is, I suppose, equally as possible that the second half of his journey is a further descent into the underworld and isn't this path of redemption that's laid out in the hero's myth. But either way, Whether it's this new trilogy or the old compilation, it's pretty heavily implied that Genesis' story is not over. Whether or not he will appear in the new FF7 trilogy to complete his arc remains to be seen. But when we take note of the fact that his story was never finished, that Crisis Core leaves him off at the midway point, that he seems to be compatible with this hero's myth, and considering all this, with the new installment in the trilogy being named Rebirth and the words Rebirth having the same color scheme as Genesis, as I always like to say, it opens the door for us to at the very least start asking some questions. But what do all of you think is what I want to know now. Do you expect we will see Genesis in the new trilogy? Do you agree that his arc has only been half told? And do you find my hero's journey analysis applicable to the situation? Let me know. Anyway, you ladies and gentlemen, be good out there, be good to yourselves and each other, and I will see all of you beautiful sickos and normies next time.